Starting out this morning with Module 6 on form behavior. Remember, we have 10 modules altogether, so we'll make it all the way up through Module 6 this week, and then we'll pick up with Module 7 on Tuesday next week. So our learning objectives for today, we're going to learn more about actions. We've talked briefly about actions in the previous chapters, but in this chapter we get into them in a whole lot more detail, and we'll talk about all the different ways that we can affect the way that actions look and feel to the users, where they're placed to a certain point in the interface. We can manage all of that. We'll also talk about some things that are not as intuitive when you just see the name of them, like row bound. We're going to talk about what row bound is and how to row bound an action, how to manage field behavior for things like default values. A lot of times we typically use, like, let's say most of our customers might be from the same state. So we could go in and make it easier on our users if we just default to the most common state for all of our customers. So we've got default values that we can work with. We've got combo boxes that we can use to allow our users to pick from a small list of information, and also to hide maybe things like complex codes and that type of thing that they don't need to be aware of, and give them some simple text to pick from. And then finally, we've got Zoom Forms. I think Zoom Forms is either the last thing in the chapter or working with a mobile device entity. Since I have the mobile device entity last in the bullets, it's probably the last thing. So that's our agenda for today. There's not very many learning objectives, but they're pretty interesting topics, I think. So today we're going to address another set of questions. Yesterday we had a set of questions at the beginning of the module, and you can see we have almost as big a set of questions today that we're going to answer. So the first question, I'm just going to start over here from the left. How do I look up information in another form? So we're going to address that towards the end of the chapter today. We're going to talk about Zoom Forms. How do I control what happens? Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. We'll go back. How do I control what happens when the user leaves a form? So there we'll talk about some more of these properties, right? We're going to talk about several new properties today. How do I control what mode the form is in when it's opened? Another property. In fact, we have several properties here all in a row. How do I display a default value? We've already talked about that some moving into the chapter, so we'll learn how to set that property. And in a combo box, how do I populate a list field for my users to pick from? We're going to learn how to configure combo boxes with lists of data. And then going back around kind of clockwise, how do I control the data refresh when I'm returning to a form? And then finally, how do I control where user action buttons appear? So a lot of different questions we'll address in this module, a lot of new properties. So our first main topic is action rendering in mobile apps. So we'll look at some of the default behavior, and then we'll look at the ways that we can manage some of that default behavior. So default action rendering, it all depends on things like the on-action statements in the actual code for the application. I'll give you an example of that here in a minute. So the order of these special on-action statements by default will be the order that the options or actions that the user sees appears in. It also depends on the type of platform you're working with, whether it's Android or iOS, and the type of device you're working with and the orientation of the device. So it depends on whether you're using a phone or a tablet, and whether you're in portrait view or landscape view sometimes. Has a lot to do with how those actions look on the interface or how they're rendered. So this is probably just as good a place as any to show you how the on-action statements affect the order of the action rendering. So let's just take a look at that just to get you started this morning. We'll start out with a short demo. Bring up Genero Mobile. And I've got a special application, just a very small, very simple application this morning that we can use so that you can see the default rendering, at least on the emulator this morning. So I've got this application, this very simple application and just an empty form. Let me bring up this empty form. See, there's literally nothing in the form. It's completely empty. I've just got it there so I can run this application and have it display on my virtual device. So really, we're just looking at the code, a short BDL program. Don't pay too much attention to the syntax or anything of that sort in this program. We have a whole module on that next week. So for right now, just focus on this part right here. Okay, we have a menu dialog statement here. And then inside this menu, we've got some special on-action statements. Now, your generated code will have something similar, right? Whenever we go through and configure all these different properties on our forms and our record and our entity, that generates the code, and part of that code generation will be some of these on-action statements. We don't see them in our diagrams, but they're under the cover in the code. So here's an on-action update, and in this part right here where it says display selected update is called the action handler. And all that is what do you want to do if the user picks that option, if they pick the update action or trigger the update action. So all we're going to have them do here is just display a message. So that's all that happens when the user triggers that particular action. Then I have on action cancel and just another display message there. But this time I'm going to have them exit the menu. That would be maybe something that you do sometimes when a user cancels. You'd either exit a form or exit the application. And in this case, I'm just exiting the menu. And that will, in turn, exit the application since it's so short. And then on action append, and I'm just displaying a message there. And then finally, my last action is to exit. And again, I'm just exiting the menu, which in turn has the effect of exiting this small application. So let's take a look here. The order that I expect my update action to be in is number 1, right, because I have it first in my menu statement. Then I should expect to see the cancel, and then the append, and then finally the exit. So let's see if that's what we actually have. All right, so here's my form. Remember, it was just an empty form, so it looks pretty simple here. But if we hold it up here where you can see these actions, you can see that they are in the same order here on the form as we have them in the code. Now, there's ways that we can override this behavior, and that's what this chapter is all about, is learning the defaults and then some of the ways that we can manage the defaults or change the defaults. So here's our update. Notice that in our emulator we have room up here for one icon in our action bar area here, and it's the update option. So there's the update option. It's this little pencil icon. And then over here in the overflow area we have our other menu options. So there's our on action cancel at the top. The next action statement we had was on action append, so we see that next, and then finally the last one was exit. Now, something I just want to point out real quick here is notice that cancel is in uppercase, or not in uppercase, but it has a capital C, append has a capital A, and exit does not, which seems really strange at first. But we're going to learn why in this chapter, why that's the case. There's special configuration files or resource files that play a role in the way all of these things look in the form. So there's a reason why exit right now has a small case E and the other two have an uppercase letter. All right, so that's a good place to start, I think. So we'll abort that and go back to our slides. So here it's saying, as I mentioned a minute ago, the action rendering also depends on whether you're viewing the form with a tablet or a phone, and then the orientation. Are you in portrait mode or are you in landscape mode? and all of those things also affect the default rendering for the form. So you'll have more actions appear in the default action area at the top and the bottom whenever you're working with tablets or you're working in landscape mode. Here we're talking specifically about Android, and in a minute we'll talk about iOS. So in Android, we have an action bar. So we're looking at this action bar up at the top. The app icon and the title of the current form display in the upper left-hand corner. And we're going to learn how to set the image for the icon and the title various ways. Later next week, we'll be talking about all of that. So for right now, just be aware of how they're rendered. So the icon and the title are up in the left-hand corner. There's a view control area that allows the user to switch between views. You can't see that very well in this screenshot, but right up in here somewhere, there should be a little icon that tells the user he can select that, and it drops down and gives him a list of different views so that he can change the view. Action buttons on the right-hand side. So here's our action buttons up here at the top, all the way across here. And again, how many of these icons or buttons that you see up there really depend on the space available for the device a lot of times. So actions that don't fit, if I have more actions than it can show up here, then those are going to appear in Android in an overflow area over here. The three vertical dots is the overflow area. So that's Android and the action bar on an Android device. So more about action views on Android. Common default action views automatically get a standard Android decoration. So we don't have to go in. We're going to learn how to configure some of these resource files this week and next week. And there's a special file called the action default file. One of the things we don't want to do is go in and configure that action default file to have a bunch of special images that we want to display, especially not if they're images that are typically a standard image for Android or iOS. So usually we want to use the decorations that come with the operating system. And Genero provides those by default, so there shouldn't be very much of that special configuration that we have to do. All of that is done for us. And you can see that here in this screenshot. If you look at the screenshot, you can see the edit icon right here. No one configured that in a special resource file, or I didn't configure that in a special resource file. Same thing here with my exit, and the same thing for cancel. Those are all predefined, right, because they're standards for Android. So that's what I was talking about. We do have the ability to manage that with Android. We can specify certain images that we want to use, but for all of the standard decorations, we want to leave those alone. So notice no text is used for the standard icons that you see there. It's just the picture, just the image. The default action view gets a built-in icon if the action name, remember when we created a button, if you did the lab yesterday, the button had a name. We'll say the button was called View, right, or Maps. And then if the button name, which is the name of the action, matches the name of one of their default images, then it's going to go ahead and display it automatically. So edit or modify are both actions that are default names, and we get this default icon, this pencil icon. Same thing with append, right? The action name append is also a name that's used for Android append or add. So we get the default append option, the plus symbol that you might have seen. So a lot of those, you can actually find a full list of all the default decorations for Android and iOS in our documentation. We have the entire list, and we even have the images there and the action name associated with those so that you can see which ones will automatically be rendered for you. So notice the very last thing down here, the action views that you see in the overflow area for Android are text only. You're not going to see any icons in the overflow area. Close, cancel, and accept. So this looks like a mouthful, but it's actually very simple if you just look at it. If a close action is defined, it's assigned to the back button. So the Android system back button, we can use that just like we can an action that we have defined separately. So down here at the bottom of the screen, that is automatically assigned to the close action. If the close action is defined, that will work automatically. You don't have to do anything to tie that to close, the action close. If close is not defined, right, if we're not using that in our application, but we're using cancel in our application, then the back button is assigned to the cancel action. And then finally, if neither one of them are used in your app, if neither one of them is setting your properties, for example, but you are using accept in your properties, like let's say you're allowing the user to add or modify, and you're using the action accept when you're finished, then accept is assigned to the back button. But typically the close action is defined or the cancel action is defined, and usually the back button is assigned automatically to one of those. And then up here at the top, we'll also see the X, and that's another one of those standard Android icons. We don't have to do anything to configure that. It's just automatically rendered that way. Now here we're switching to iOS, and we're going to talk about the navigation controller on iOS devices. So grab my highlighter real quick. On iOS devices, we have a navigation controller at the top of the screen, so that's how they refer to this instead of the action bar. So the first part here is the navigation bar that provides a path through all the different screens. The user can look at that and tell that he can go back to a previous screen, for example. If we have accept, cancel, or close actions defined in our application, that's rendered as a back button. So right there, anytime we want to go back to the previous screen or close this screen to go back to the previous screen, we use that back button. If there's a previous form or window, the button shows the title. So if we're coming from, let's say, a master form to a detail form, then the detail form will show the title of the master form, right? So we know where we're going back to. Number 2 here is what they call the common action pane. So this is where our default action views are displayed for iOS. There's our plus symbol there for append or add, very similar to what we see with Android. So there are some similarities, of course. And then finally, our toolbar pane for iOS is down at the bottom. So display actions that don't fit up at the top in that common pane display down here. And if there's still not enough room, then we have an overflow icon to the right of that. So on iOS, the decoration for well-known actions, that's the ones that are predefined, right? They're standardized actions that most people are familiar with. Accept or cancel or edit or modify, those terms a lot of times are used interchangeably, and they account for both of those. For iOS, the text is internationalized, and that's all automatic as well. So if the language for the mobile device is in English or set to English, the accept text will be done. If it's German, it's fertig, something similar to that. And if it's French, it's okay. So all of that is just automatic for iOS. The default action view gets a built-in icon, and this is going to look familiar, just like Android, if the action name you're using matches one of their default images. And again, accept, cancel, modify, edit, append. You can get the complete list in the documentation if you're curious. And you can see what the icons look like. Now this is where we're different from working with Android. So with iOS, if you go into one of these special resource files, like this action default file that I was talking about earlier, and you go in and try to make a change to the image it uses, or the text that it uses to display, like OK or done, it actually ignores you with iOS because it always sticks to the standards for iOS. So that's actually a good thing because you want your application to look like an iOS application is supposed to look. So to try to make that easier, we enforce that because otherwise you'll have an application that doesn't look like what your users are expecting to see when they run an app on an iPhone, for example. Okay, so now we're looking at some ways that we can change the way Actions Overflow rendering is done. So a minute ago, we saw the different ways that the overflow rendering was done for Android and iOS, and a top menu is another way to handle that. So notice here that they've gone in. Right there in the form, by the way, is one place that you can configure a top menu. You can also do it with a special resource file, but the easiest way to do it, at least for class purposes this week, will be to do it right there in the form. So if you want to tinker with it in class, you can do it right in the form. Now, in the custom code chapter, we'll talk more about these resource files, so let me just give you a heads up on the general idea. Most of the time, if you're going to have an app that has many forms, it's a fairly complex application, you might have multiple folks working on the application, it's a good idea to use these special resource files because you can standardize all of your special settings for, let's say, action defaults and the text that you want to use for them, especially for the ones that are not the standard ones for Android or iOS. You can customize them and you can standardize them with resource files. Same thing here with these top menus. I could just create it here in the form, and we can certainly do that here in class, but if you do have an app that you have more than one person working on, or that's fairly complex and has a lot of forms in it, probably the better way to do it would be to create a resource file. There are special resource files for top menus, and then everybody can use the same resource file. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel in every form like this. And that way everybody sees the same top menu in every form, and you get more of a standardized look and feel for the entire application that way. You don't want one form to open up with a bunch of menu options that are, you know, in this and that order, and then the next form open up and all the options be in a different order. And that's what you can achieve by using these special resource files. So again, we'll talk more about those somewhat today because we'll talk about the Action Defaults resource file today, but mostly we'll talk about these next week when we get to the custom code chapter. All right, so for right now, a top menu, it doesn't matter if you've set it in the form or whether you've put it in a special top menu file, resource file. It's a way to change the way the overflow area is rendered. So over here you can see they've just typed in some options here in a top menu, and then notice how it appears over here. We've got a special top menu icon up here at the top, and then when the user selects that, he can see some special overflow options. So they're going to appear over here in the left. Grab my highlighter here. Whoops, I missed. Over here instead of in the Action Overflow area over here. Okay. This is the action default file that I've been referring to for the last couple of pages. This action defaults file is what I was talking about that you can use to control the appearance of your actions. A while ago when I was showing you that empty form and I had my options up and we were looking at them, and the exit in my form actually had, I think, a lowercase e, if I remember right, and all the other options had uppercase first letters. And I said that that was because there were some special settings in a special file. Well, this is that special file. This is the action defaults file where you can configure things like the text that the user sees for a particular action or menu option on your form. You can specify the image that it uses here, like the special icon that the user sees. You can even determine in here whether or not there is a default action view displayed for a specific option, menu action or option. So take a look at some of these. Here's an action for actions called exit, like the one I had in my my small empty form a minute ago. Here's what the text should be. So I didn't have that set in my action defaults file when I was showing you that form earlier, so it ended up with a small case e. Here's for update, and instead of even seeing the word update in the form, the users are going to see the word modify with an uppercase M. So you can specify the text as something completely different from the actual name of the action, and that's fairly common. Right, here's the action name when you have a list of rows for you to be able to see the first row, the previous row, next row, last row. Well, the text you see isn't first row, it should be first if you have this action defaults file configured like this. And this is our default dbapp.4ad actions default that comes with your BAM mobile project or mobile project, whichever. Either one of those comes with this special action defaults file. And these are the settings in that. So if you have a new project and you created it with that BAM mobile project option we talked about, then you automatically have one of these in your project directory structure in that resources file. You can customize it if you like. If you choose to do that, the easiest way to do it is just to make a copy of it there in the directory, maybe call it dbapp.4ad old, right? Or make a copy of it first and then call one of them old and the other one keep the same name, and then go in and edit it to change the text or whatever you like to make it something different. But keep the original one just in case you want to go back and see what the defaults were at some point. Sometimes you change your mind later, and it's good not to work with the original file just in case you want to go back to the originals later. Okay, so this is the action defaults file. And again, one of the things you won't see in here, I was looking for one with an image. You can also specify, for example, images that are displayed, but for all of the standard icons, images for icons that we talked about, those won't be defined in here because they're just built in to Genero Mobile. It'll automatically find those, and they do not have to be configured in this action default file. We get those automatically. Okay, well, before I go on, let me just show you a few things about the action default file. This is probably a good place to do it. Now this little, I just created that as the normal project, so we don't want to look at that one. Let's look at a real one. Let's look at our Pool Doctors application. That would be the best one for us to look at. So here's Pool Doctors. And let's just talk about this Action Defaults file. Now notice here under Resources, Pool Doctors has had some configuration done. They've gone in and configured actually 3 different special Action Default resource files. One of them is just kind of a generic pooldoctors.4ad for when the application is not specific to Android or iOS. So if it can't detect which front end it's running on, it's going to use this generic one. Or if it's running on something that's not iOS or Android, it'll pick that one. And then here's the one that they've configured that's for Android, that they maybe have some few special things they want to display. And here's one that they've used for iOS. So if I'm troubleshooting or if I'm seeing things that I'd like to change and I'm wondering where to change them, especially when you're working with resource files or toolbars, just about anything like this that you can load programmatically or have in a directory structure and have it pick up automatically, it's sometimes good to be able to figure out which one your application's using. And let me just show you a quick way to do that. Let's go ahead and run Pool Doctors. Okay, so it's running. Make sure it comes up okay. Make sure I haven't tinkered with it here. It does look strange this morning. All right, well, I don't think that will matter for what we're going to do here. And then right here under Tools, Android Tools, here it is down at the bottom. There's a Show AUI Tree option that I just wanted to tell you about. As we go through here, it's nice to talk about some of the debugging tools that you can use. If you're working with an application, you may not even be debugging so much as just trying to figure out exactly, like in this case, which resource file is this emulator using right now. And there it is right there. This AUI tree is a nice debugging tool because it goes out and pulls all the information about my abstract user interface, you call it. So everything that's in my user interface tree, which includes the form, the window I'm using, any resource files that are loaded, like this Action Default file right now. I'm using the Action Defaults from this Pool Doctors Android .4ad file. If I was using a top menu, that would show up here as well. So everything about this form and application, as far as I have made it in the application for all the forms that are open, will show up in this abstract user interface tree, or AUI tree. So remember this. I actually have you use this in the lab later just to make sure that you remember that it's there. Very useful for figuring out exactly what properties are set and that type of thing. This one doesn't have very much in it. We'll come back to this after a while. Apparently I have done something to my Pool Doctors app, and we'll take a break after a while and I'll get it fixed up so that you can see that better. Alright, so don't forget that AUI tree. You'll actually experiment with that some in your lab this afternoon. So here's another screenshot of what the Action Defaults file looks like. And notice here is the append option over here and a screenshot that has the append option showing. And you can see here it is in the Action Default file. The name of the action, notice, is lowercase. But since we're using this Action Default file and it has it defined, it's got the text equal append with an uppercase A. So a while ago when we were looking and we had some things that were uppercase first letters and some things that were not, it was depending on whether or not that specific option or action is defined in this file. So this one is, and there it is in uppercase A. So I can control it with the 4AD file, but remember that the images, especially all these icons we've been seeing for edit and cancel, modify with the pencil icon. Those are all built-in images, and we don't want to change those here in the action default file. They're not set here, and you don't want to edit them. So another type of a form attribute or form element, I guess would be a better word, is a toolbar. You can use a toolbar to let you control the order of the actions that are rendered. So a minute ago, we took a look at that empty form, and our actions were being rendered based on the order of those on action statements that we have in the code. So it's very simple, very easy to read that way. Well, again, you may want to standardize the order that your actions appear in so that all the different forms in an application all have the same look and feel. So a user feels comfortable about what actions he's going to see and gets comfortable quickly with the order that they're in so he can use the app more efficiently, faster. So you want some sort of customization and standardization for that. So one of the ways you can do that is with a toolbar. So you can add a toolbar, and then you can put these actions in the order that you want them to be in. So the ones that are in the toolbar are going to be rendered in the order that the toolbar specifies. But if you do have a form, let's say, that uses some additional actions that are not in the toolbar, then those will be rendered next after the last toolbar entry. And it goes back to that default behavior at that point, where they're rendered in the order that they're in the code. Excuse me. So we can do that as well. Go back to our simple form for that. Cancel out of that. There we go. All right, so here's our empty form that we had a minute ago that we were looking at. And just to remind you and to make sure that my emulator is still okay after its experience with my funny pool doctors there that I've messed up some way. So here it is, the way it looked before. So here's the update. We're getting that standard Android icon for update, the pencil icon. And then over here in our overflow area, we're getting them in the order of our action statements. On action update is our icon up here. There's cancel, append, and exit. So there's our options. So now let's experiment some. Kill that. All right, I want to be able to go back to that if we need to. All right, so let's pull up the form. So there's our empty form. You can actually add toolbars, top menus, various of these menu options right here with a right-click option in the form itself. So I can do it here. See where it says add an action default list, add a toolbar. And again, for these resources, resource lists or toolbars, you can add them to a form so that they're part of the form itself and get loaded with the form. Or you can use these resource files so that you can load the resource file independently of an individual form. So for our purposes, right now we're going to use this, whoops, I picked top menu by mistake. Let's get rid of that. All right. So I'm going to do it over here in the form structure view. That's where I usually do it. But remember, you can do it over here in the form itself, or you can do it in the form structure view. Before I do it, though, notice that you can also import a toolbar that you've already configured. So you can go out there and configure a toolbar file, one of these special files, and you can import it that way. I don't have one, so we'll go ahead and add one this way. So there's my toolbar. Notice I've got properties for the toolbar, and now I'm just going to add items to my toolbar. So one thing to remember, is that the name of the item in the toolbar has to match the name of the action. So I need to be very specific so that it matches the name of the action in my code here. So there's my, oops, I don't want it in that order because that's the order we have it in now. That wouldn't explain anything to you. So let's try that part again. So it was already in update order first. So let's make exit first, right? Because exit, I believe, was all the way down at the bottom on our form previously. So this time we'll put it at the very top. So we'll put exit at the top. And then right here is where you specify the text for your toolbar item, and I'm just going to call it exit. So now we have the first toolbar item. Let's just add another one or two. So we don't want to use exit. Let's say, how about append next? We'll do append. There's the text for append. We'll just go ahead and add them all. That way you can see all of them. And then we had an update. I'm going to call it update. And one more item. Here's our cancel. I think we had a cancel as well. So I think that's all we have left. And we'll make our text cancel with a capital C. All right, so we've just added a toolbar to our form. So now when this form gets loaded, our toolbar will get loaded as well. So let's save it. Let's give it a try. See if it looks any different this time. And it does right away. All right, so there's our form. This time, instead of having that pencil icon, right, the default icon for Android for the edit option or update option, this time we've got exit configured first in our toolbar, so that's what we see first. And for exit, we're just getting text for that. So that's the standard for exit. And then over here in our overflow area are the rest of our different options that we have defined. These are our actions. And notice this time they're not defined in the same order that they were before. Last time we had update and then cancel, I think, then append, and then finally at the very bottom was exit. But now with this toolbar we've completely rearranged the order of the actions. So that's what you can do with toolbars. And again, you can do that as well with a resource file, and we'll talk about that later next week. All right, so adding a toolbar lets you control the order of the actions rendered. So some widgets can trigger actions. I think you've already worked with a button widget. If you did the lab yesterday, or if you were able to do the lab yesterday, you worked with a button widget. And in the button widget, the name of the button is the important part, like that toolbar item that we just configured. Remember, the name of the toolbar item is what associates that toolbar item with the action itself in the code. And it's the same thing here for button widgets. So it's the name that's the important part. And then button edits are typically used for Zoom forms. So later we'll look at Zoom forms and we'll be looking at button edits for that. So for button edits, it's not the name, interestingly enough. The button edits have a action property. And so there's a special action property for button edits, and it has to match the name of the action in the code, or the action that you have defined in your other properties. And we'll see all about that here shortly. So the action property has to be matched to the action name. We talked about row-bound actions earlier, said it's not as intuitive a word as some of the words we've been using back and forth, like cancel and accept. But row-bound is referring to the idea of an action being kind of built into the row so that you can just swipe the row and delete. I imagine most of you are very familiar with that from working with mobile devices. It's a very common thing. So for us, the delete action is just automatically what they call row bound, right? It's implicitly row bound. So you don't have to do anything special to make that happen. Now, if there's any other actions that you want to row bound to a row, then you do have to configure it, but not for the delete action. So all you have to do is swipe the row and select it, and then at that point you should get a message about deleting. And that's all automatic. All you have to do is define the action itself for delete. So for other actions, actions other than delete, you do have to check the row-bound property on the relation. So this is a relation-based property, and show the action, and that will show the action on each row. There's a little question down at the bottom of the screen here, and at this point you should be able to answer that based on what we've covered this morning. It says, why does the action say open order list over here on the left? Let me grab my highlighter so I can point it out. So right here, the action over here says open order list, but the resulting action that we see on the actual form over here is the word orders. And we talked about that earlier in the module, and it's because we have a 4AD file, and in that 4AD file we have our action name, and then we have this nice attribute or property called text. And we can set the text that the user actually sees to something completely different than the actual action name. All right, so we'll cover just maybe one more slide, and then it's actually time for our break already. So we've got open mode and default mode. These are some properties. I think we've talked briefly about them maybe on Monday or Tuesday, but we haven't talked about them in detail. The open mode, of course, has to do with the mode that a form's in when it first opens up. So the open mode typically by default is display, which works just fine for a view action, you know, where you're opening up a form to view a list of rows, for example. But when you're doing other types of operations or functions on in a grid form, for example, let's say you're doing an add operation. When the form opens up, you don't want it to open up in display mode. You want it to open up in add mode, which is what we're seeing here in this screen, or in this screenshot. So the open mode depends, that you want to use depends on the type of user task that you're trying to configuring. So that's why it's really based on the relation, is because remember we can have a relation for each type of user task. So since we're configuring our relations for each task, we also want to be able to configure things like the open mode. How do we want that form to open when we're opening it in order to add a row or to modify a row or just view a row? So that's an important property when we're configuring these relations, these different types of tasks by configuring relations. The default mode is the mode it goes back to after it leaves an operation if you don't have anything else set for it to do, like if it's going back to a previous form or this form. So how do I control what mode the form is? And we'll explore that additionally after the break. And leaving a form. We'll go ahead and cover this leaving a form before the break as well, because these two kind of go together. So when you're leaving a form, you can also specify what you want to do, or the form behavior. So let's pretend for a minute that I've been in a form and I have added a row. So what do I want to do when I have finished adding a row and I've clicked accept? Do I want the row to still be displayed and still be sitting there, or would I find that a little confusing? Those are the kind of things you need to think about when you're trying to figure out the on close or the on accept behavior. Notice up here on accept for display, they've got exit form. So when they finish looking at something in this form, or when they finish adding something in this, well, in this case it's display behavior, right? So when they finish looking at something in this form, if they hit accept, it's going to exit the form and go back to the parent form if there was one. Same thing for cancel, same thing for close, but they have that open here so you can see all your different options. So you can return back to the default mode at any time here, which usually the default mode is display, but you can change that if you want to in the record. Caller mode is when the form is initially opened, how the relation is set that's opening the form. You can stay in mode, which again is what I was talking about a minute ago. Let's pretend for a minute that I'm adding something. So I add everything to a particular form that I want. I hit accept. What am I expecting that form to do? If I say stay in mode, it's just going to sit there, right? Stay in that add mode so that I can add another row if I want to. And that might be completely appropriate for some applications. Any kind of an operation where a user might be entering multiple jobs, for example, all at one time, that may be an excellent mode for them to be in so they don't have to keep clicking the add button to go back in there. So again, these properties, you can tweak and tune them depending on the application and the functionality of the application so that they do just what your user would like them to do. So here on leaving a form, and this goes with the previous slide, so we'll do 3 forms, 3 different pages all at once before we take our break. So here they're just showing you how to think through this process. There's nothing really new here. It's just kind of how to think about it when you're sitting there configuring something. So if I'm in display mode and the user triggers the accept action, I want to stay in the current mode, which I think would look a little strange, right? It's just sitting there displaying even though I've hit the accept action. Or do I want to close the form and close the application if it's the last form? That might be the best option, right? Exit form. If I'm in display mode and I hit accept, I probably want to leave the form. And then modify. If the mode is modify and the user specifies the, let's do something different, the cancel action. What do I want the form to do? Do I want it to return to the mode specified as the default? That might be an appropriate option, right? I can see that being okay. Do I want to return to the previous mode? Well, it depends. You just have to see how the behavior was. Or do you want to stay in the current mode? I probably would not stay in the current mode. What I might do if I hit cancel with modify, so I would probably say exit form. But again, it depends on the circumstances and whether or not the form you're working in has been opened from a parent form and that type of thing. So all of this, in my opinion, is really tied to the functionality you're working on with that specific form and that specific task for the user. That's probably why we have options like this, right? If it was always going to be the same behavior for a display and an accept, then our developers would have pre-configured all of that and cast it in stone. But since they didn't do that, that tells us that these are all things that are based on user preference and your preference as a developer. All right, well, I think this is probably a good place to go ahead and take our break. We've had like 3 different concepts there in a row, so let's go ahead and take let's say a 10-minute break is probably good for right now since we started a little late today. So we'll say it's 12:05 Central Time, or 5 minutes after the hour, and let's start back at 15 after the hour, just 10 minutes away. All right, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Let's start out after the break with looking at a few of these things. We talked about the row-bound action. Let me just make sure I'm not Let's go back a little further than that. We saw toolbars. And I think the last thing we saw was a toolbar. So let's look at this button. I know some of you weren't able to do the labs. So specifically, get the right job here. There we go. Specifically, talk about how the button can trigger an action. So if you haven't done your lab yet, that would maybe be a mystery. So here what we're going to see is right here in our job note grid or job header grid form. I'm trying to remember the name of this form. I've got all these different pieces and parts of a job that I can go look at the details. And in our lab, of course, we're working on this notes area. So right here is a button, and if I click that button or select that button, then I'm actually triggering an action, and that action in turn is opening up this job note list form so that I can look at a list of notes. So that's what we're going to look at. So we're talking here in the chapter about some widgets being able to trigger actions. So let's look at that notes button, since that's a good one for us to start with. So let me bring it over here. Here's our Pool Doctors application. You can go ahead and kill that. And we were looking at the job header grid form, right? We were in there. And then the job header grid form has this notes area, and there's the button right there, kind of off to the side of the form. Drag these properties over. So there's the button. You can see that in the form structure view. And then down here I'm going to pull up the properties for that button. So right here, I don't know if you remember, but for buttons, it's the name of the button that is associated with the action. So if you note the name of the button here, we've called it Notes. So that's the name of our button in our parent form, which is this job header grid form. And if we go back here, back to our BA diagram, and we look at the relation now that we're using to open that form, if you look at the relation, notice in the UI settings, there's an action property there, and it has an identical value. So this is a widget that can trigger an action, and what you have to configure to make that work is in the parent form. You put your button in the parent form, and you set the name of the button to something unique, like Notes in this case. And then the relation that you create between the parent form and the form that's going to display the list of notes in this case, that's where you specify the action property there, and you want to use the exact same name as you used for the button. So that's how it's done. It's a very simple process to do that. I'm going to keep that open actually, because in a few minutes we can come back and I'll show you the rest of that. There's some other interesting properties there that we can talk about. All right, so let's see what else we've talked about. Button edits, I'm going to hold off for button edits because a little later in this chapter we're going to talk about Zoom forms, and we'll see a button edit when we talk about Zoom forms. So I'll just hold off on that one. So let's see what's next. Row bound. We talked about row bound. So let's go ahead and kick off the Pool Doctors app again. So we can see that row bound in action. It's not quite as easy to do that with an emulator, but it's doable. All right, so here's my list of notes. So let's see if I can, there we go. See if I just grab it and slide it over to the right. That's the same thing as swiping, right, if I had a real device. So it works on an emulator. So notice it says, are you sure you want to delete this record? All of that is built-in functionality. I didn't have to set any properties to tell it to do this implicit row bound for this delete operation. It just did it all by itself. So what if I didn't want it to allow users to delete notes, right? I might not want them to be able to do that. Well, I can manage that too. So I'm going to say no, I don't really want to delete that. So that's what the row bound looks like, right? And remember, it's implicit, or it's built in for deletes. But let's see why it showed up. That brings us back to our properties. So let me pull this up here. Oops. I'm just going to get rid of all this down here. Give us some more real estate here on our screen. So when we created this job note list form, if we look at our record properties for the form, even though it's a list form, remember list forms only have limited functionality. We had to go in and disable, grab this highlighter so you can see what I'm pointing at. In the functionality section of our record, we had to go in and disable the add and modify. But the rest of these are optional. It is limited functionality. We can't add to a list, we can't modify, but certainly it can display, and it also can delete if you want the users to be able to do it. But let's pretend that I didn't want users to be able to delete a note in that list. I could either disable it here in this functionality section on the record itself, and remember that's going to disable it for all the different tasks or relations that form is reused for. So remember, the record kind of has that's the main place where you would want to set all possible functionality. So I'm going to leave it set to delete there. I have to get rid of my highlighter here for just a moment. Oops, one more over. But they're here in my relation. I also can do it. See how the functionality section, grab my highlighter again. So right here in the functionality section on the relation, I also have disable delete. So I could do it just for this relation. We can pretend for a minute that maybe we have different relations for the job note list, which we don't in this case. But notice you can disable that functionality here or back in the record. So if I do that, then I'll no longer be able to do that swipe and that row bound operation. But I just wanted to show you why it was there in the first place. The reason it's there in the first place is because by configuring delete functionality in the record, and by not disabling it in the relation, then I'm actually allowing the user to delete things in the list. So that gives me then my row bound feature, just to kind of put all that together. All right, so that's row bound and how it's implicitly built into the delete, and how if I didn't like that, it's very simple to go back and disable it either at the record level or the relation level. All right, let's see if there's anything else exciting for us to look at. I didn't show you this property, but it's fairly straightforward there. We've also got a property there set in UI settings. I should have showed it to you. It's not that important to go find it. Maybe we'll look at it later, but it's right here on the relation, same area we were in a few seconds ago. Up in the UI settings section of the properties is where the row bound property is. So remember, for delete, we don't have to set the property because it's built in, but for any other action that we wanted to associate, wanted to create as a row bound action, we have to use this row bound property. So only delete has it built in. Now, open mode and default mode. So we talked a bit about that before the break. So perhaps don't want that one. All right. let's say this one we've been working on for class should be just fine to look at because you're even familiar with that one, so this will be even easier for you to understand, I think. So right up here are some of these properties. Notice I've selected the relation between job note list and job note grid. Had 3 different relations. There we go. All right, so here's our view relation. So let's just talk about that, and then we'll kind of look at the behavior. So here for this view relation, I have a special relation that's just so that the user can go out there and look at rows. I forgot for a minute, though, that during the lab, I actually told you in the lab to go ahead and allow the user to modify rows too in that view mode. So that would be an easy way for him just to pop in there and modify something if he wanted to. So you can do that, but I'm going to change it back just to display so that we can talk about it here. I'm going to save that. So now I've changed my open mode for the view action to just display. So now whenever the list form, the job note list form is opened, it's just going to be in plain old display mode for my view relation. And then here's my overall, whoops, I'm on the relation here. Let's look at this first before I get going too much. Job note list, there he is. Okay, so there's my record. So remember there's 2 places that we can do all this. So here's our functionality here, the can add, the can modify, can delete, can search, can empty, all of that's there. So that's our functionality that we've been talking about that allows the view, the modify, and the delete. And then in our entity, we've got properties. I'll open this up. And for the entity itself, this has our different behaviors here. Open mode, display, default mode, display. And it also has our behaviors here for all these different type of tasks. So notice that's on the entity. But then I can tweak that and tune it on the relation itself. So just about everything can be tweaked and tuned and changed with the relation properties. So here's my open mode here, and the entity is display. The default mode is display. So that doesn't matter what relation I'm talking about. It just has to do with the defaults for the form as a whole. So these are what I'm overriding when I set those in the relation. So this says, by default, this form, when I have a display, that's the task I'm doing, if the user clicks accept or selects accept, I'm going to exit the form. Same for cancel and close and exit. So everything's, on exit we're going to exit app. Then we have modify behavior, add behavior, search behavior, and so on. And all of these have the overall settings for the form, regardless of the relation. So for display, we're going to exit forms everywhere except for exit. And if the user selects exit, we're going to try to exit the app. And in modify behavior, on accept, we're going to return to default mode, which the mode that we enter in, which up here, if we're going by these UI settings, the default mode is display, so it's saying return back to display mode. If I cancel, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to just go back to display mode again, but on close, I'm going to exit the form and go back to a parent form if one exists, and on exit, I'm going to exit the app. And then we have the same thing here for add behavior, so I won't go through it in detail. So these are the settings for the form as a whole, and then we can tweak and tune it back here in the relation, which is what we were looking at. I kind of jumped ahead there a bit. We should have looked at all of that first. But here's our J in view relation. So that one's been created for viewing. And it's probably been tweaked a little bit by the lab because I had to do some different things in the lab. But here we're saying, okay, for display behavior, for this relation on accept, I can change it, right? I can say, oh, exit the app if I want to here. But notice by default there wasn't anything there, which means I'm using the default from the form that we looked at. And if you remember, the default from the form was, well, I have to go back and look. I've already forgotten. We'll just look real quick. Exit form. So if you forget, you can always just click on the entity and go back and look like I had to do. So anyway, two different places where these behaviors are configured, and kind of like the behaviors we talked about with functionality, they're settable in two places, but one place is kind of the overriding settings for that particular diagram element as a whole. So in this case, it's the form. All the different behaviors for the form regardless of the task. But then in the relation, I can change it for that one relation. And that gives you an awful lot of power as far as tweaking that behavior for like an add operation or a modify operation to whatever you like. And I think if you haven't done the lab, I think you'd really enjoy it because we do quite a bit of that in the lab, experimenting with the form and the way it looks when the user does an add operation. And we try it one way and then we try it another way. So that's the reason mine ended up maybe not quite the default there, was because of the lab. All right, so just kind of looking at some of the things we've been talking about there. So that puts us here to this data refresh slide. So what data do you want refreshed? So the wording in this is not as easy to read as some of the wording we've got for our different properties, but essentially, if you did the lab, you experienced this. Let's say that I open a form in order to do an add, and I'm in a parent record, and I've got, let's say, 2 notes, for example, in my job note list form, and I select the add option to add another note. So I go in and I add the note, and then I have the exit form, right, the exit form selected, so it exits back out when I hit the accept option. What do I see back in that parent form after I've added that new row? That's what this has to do with. By default, it has current row selected, right, the one you see down here towards the bottom. Let me grab my highlighter. So sometimes talking about an example or showing you an example is the way to do it. So here we've got, current row is the default, highlighted the one above it, current row. So what happened in the lab, just to give you an idea of how this works, is that we configured it to do an add. The user went in and did an add, or you did an add in the lab, added a new list note, or a note to the job, and then exited the form and came back to the parent form, and there were still only one note or 2 notes or whatever there were before. And the problem was because of this setting on the data refresh. The data refresh setting was current row, so all it was doing was refreshing the row that was selected when the form was opened and worked on. But when you go in to add a row, you want to make sure that the parent row refreshes all the rows so that it picks up the new row that's been added. And so in the lab, we had to go and change this data refresh setting to all rows so that the new row added to the job note list table was displayed. Let me see if I can show you that. Would be a lot better than just explaining it. So we'll take a peek real quick. I think it was the one on the bottom. There we go. Keep grabbing it and trying to move it around, don't I? All right, so let's just list. Whoops. There we go. All right, so right there, that data refresh is on the current row, and we had to change it back to all rows to get the behavior that we wanted. Notice you've got several options there. You've got all documents, current document, all rows, current row, and none. So typically if you're adding rows, you'll be using this all rows. I popped up in the wrong, or selected the wrong relation there as part of the problem. Okay. No, that was the right one. Oops. Get back over there. There we go. So anyway, all rows, when it's talking about the document, all documents, that has to do whenever you're going from let's say a header table to a detail table. Like this JH code to JN code. If you're interested in making sure that the rows in the header table are refreshed so that those pick up any new information or updated information, you use these document options that they're talking about here, like all documents, current document. So all data in this example or in this screenshot PowerPoint is talking about all the data in a parent-child type relationship. And then this current document is talking about the current row that's selected for the master-child table in a parent-child relationship. You don't really need to worry too much about that, I think. I haven't had to change it very often between all rows and current row. So if you have two different tables that you're working with, you work with document level things. If you're just working with one table, like our job note table, then all you need to worry about is current row or all rows. So think of it like that way. That's the easiest way for me. If I'm working with a single table, it's not a parent-child type relationship, then all I have to worry about is either none, do I just want the current row refreshed, or if it's an add operation, I probably want all rows refreshed so that I can see these new rows. If I'm working with parent-child type relationships and I'm looking at information that has to be tracked by a key or found by a key, then think of it in terms of documents. And then I can choose to refresh the current document, which is the current row selected by the master or parent in the relationship, or all documents to go through and refresh everything in that join condition. So it sounds maybe more complicated than it really is. So just keep it in terms of whether or not what you're working with is, like in our case, just the job note list table. That's the only table involved. I can just work with all rows and current rows. If I was working with a join type condition, then I need to be more concerned with documents to make sure everything gets refreshed. If I'm looking at fields that are involved in both tables, then I need to refresh both. So all documents are current document. We talked about default values, I think, already today. Beneficial to set default values in the meta schema. Do you remember from yesterday we talked about how if you want to, and a recommended thing is to go back in and update your meta schema with all kinds of good information like labels, right? The text for all of your labels, the widgets that you'd like to use for a lot of these columns whenever your forms are created. And then here again is something else, default values that you can set in the meta schema. So if I set all those in the meta schema, then that way when I come along and I'm to this point where we are now, I don't have to do all of this in each individual form. Instead, when I create my records by using these wizards that we've been looking at to create new forms with a wizard, then it automatically picks up those default values from my meta schema settings, and then whenever the form is used, the form will have that default value in it. So that's the benefit of doing this at the meta schema. But if you haven't done it in the meta schema, or if for some reason this form needs a different default than what you have in the meta schema, you can certainly set it on the form. So there's a default value for that. So that's at the form level. Now here's combo boxes. So combo boxes are another type of user-friendly widget, like a button or a button edit that we're going to see coming up, I think, pretty quickly here with the Zoom forms. The idea here is to hide maybe some special columns that the user doesn't really understand or know anything about, like maybe a country code or a job code, and instead you could give them a combo box. And a combo box just has simple text that's recognizable that they can pick from without having to understand the underlying complex values that are actually stored in the actual database table. So that's the benefit of a combo box. It's to make life easier for your user. So with a combo box, it's just another type of widget. So you would just go up in the field that has the problematical information. You're just going to make that a combo box widget like they're doing state here. It looks like in this example the only two valid states are California and Ohio. Kind of an interesting combination. California and Ohio. So they're creating a combo box, and the idea with this combo box is so that the users just have to pick between those two choices. They don't have to type it in every time or make sure they get the right abbreviation for those states. Makes it easier. Now one thing that's I notice here is that we have two different settings, two different fields for a combo box, or values or properties, whatever you want to call them. Properties is the best word. We've got the name and the text. So the text is just what the user sees. So that's the user-friendly part. The name is the actual value that goes back to be stored in the database table. So the name is the part that matters to the application. The text is the part that the user sees displayed in the form. And all you have to do to configure a combo box is just go out here and specify a list of values for the combo box like we see over here on the right. Now combo boxes are another thing that are kind of customizable. You can also load them dynamically. You can have an initializer function. Over here would be the name of a function that you had written to actually dynamically load the combo box or statically load the combo box. But by that I mean you can actually load the combo box values from a database if you want to. So for our purposes, we can just set it right here in the form, or in the properties for the form, and there's our list of combo box items. There's always 2 or 3 ways to do things, and it's just figuring out which one is the easiest for you to manage. In this case, I think just setting it in the form is fine. Let me show you a combo box that we actually have out here so you can see how it's working. Let's see, I think we have a combo box, I think, on this job detail grid form. For status, the status field, if you notice, it's a combo box. So all they've done is they've used this convert widget, and it was just in plain old edit field, and they went down here and selected a combo box. Now the reason we don't see combo box in this list right now is because it's already selected, so it leaves it out of the list. But they've selected a combo box. And then for combo boxes, right down here we have our items, got entered, delivered, and invoice. Now this is the text value that we're seeing here. So here's what it looks like when you add items to a combo box. So here's the name column, or the name property, excuse me, and this is the part that matters to the database. So this is what the programmer, or our developer or designer is after, is a 0, 1, or a 2. But what the user is going to see is entered, delivered, or invoiced. That's much easier for an end user to remember than a number like a 0, 1, or a 2. So that just, again, a user-friendly widget to make life a lot easier for the user. So if you want to see that in action here, so you can see what we were just talking about. Here it is. It's in this job detail grid form. And right down here is the status field, right? The status field, remember, had been changed to a combo box. So that's how the user can pick his entry. So it just pops up, says entered, delivered, or invoiced. He doesn't have to know that the database entry is really a 0, a 1, or a 2. All he has to know is the simple text answer. So that's a combo box. You see, they're very simple to configure, and it makes life easy as well for the users. All right, so now we're ready to look at Zoom Forms. We're on the downhill track here. Almost finished. I think we have Zoom Forms and then the Device API, and that's not a whole lot of slides left to go. So behavior of Zoom Forms. Well, you set them up on the diagram, just like we did all of our other forms, our CRUD forms and our list forms. We call an action from a CRUD form button edit widget. So a button edit is another widget that is able to invoke an action, and it's done a little differently than a button, but very, very similar. If you can do a button, you can do a button edit. So very limited functionality for Zoom Forms. We've got this can display, can search, can empty functionality for the Zoom Forms. Return selected value back to the calling form. So the whole purpose of a Zoom Form is similar to a combo box, but a Zoom Form allows you to display a long list of information if you like. They can search in a Zoom form for information. So it is similar to a combo box, but not exactly the same thing. Combo boxes are good for 2 or 3 simple items to select from, like 0, 1, 2, or 3. Zoom Forms are good for picking from perhaps even a long list that they can search in. But another user-friendly widget. It's the same basic idea. So here is implementing a Zoom form. We use that implement option just like we did for a CRUD form, except this time, of course, we picked the Zoom form from database option. Modify the CRUD form to trigger the Zoom. That's our button edit that we've been talking about. Configure the relation, just like we do for all of our different forms. And in the relation, we're going to set that action property just like we do with a button, but we also are going to set well, that's actually a little bit old right now. Now it's just, oh, it's right, position source field property. So we have one property there to configure, the source field property. So here's the build the form part. We're going to select the table that contains values that we want the user to be able to pick from in the Zoom form. Now typically what you're after with the Zoom form, grab my highlighter here, like in this case we're after the PR code most likely to pull it back to a parent form. But we can offer the user something that he's familiar with, like in this case a description of the product. A description of the product is a lot easier for a user to select from than a code. So that's the idea here with the Zoom form, to give them some user-friendly information to use to help them pick the right code. So we're going to display both of these fields of information to the user. He selects one of them from the list. that then gets returned back to the parent form. So whenever you create the Zoom form, you're going to use a table container, and you're going to make sure that you have the field that needs to be filled in, right, by the user has to be included when you pick your columns with the Zoom form, and then you can also include additional fields as well. So here's talking about modifying the CRUD form, and by the CRUD form they're talking about the parent form that's going to open this Zoom form, or the user's going to trigger an action in this CRUD form. So what we're going to do to modify it is find the field that maybe the users have a little problem with figuring out, and in this case it's the product field. And one of the things that has to be in place is that we need to have a key. So in this case we do have a foreign key relationship here to this product table from this job detail grid. So that part is taken care of, it's the relationship. So here we're selecting this product field. Oops. Let me see here. I think I went forward. Product field. And then over here we're going to change the widget. Remember, we just right click on the field, change it to a button edit. And then right down here we're going to specify the action name. I forgot to show you that, but it's way down at the bottom of the properties, and it's in the miscellaneous section. You just give it a unique name at this point. It can't be the same name as some other button or button edit that you already have. So this one's called JD Product Zoom. And then we have to set that in the relation then for the Zoom form. So here's our calling form over here on the left. The job detail grid is the one that actually needs that product information input into the form, and then it's going to open this new product list Zoom form. So we create a relation between the two of them, and then in our relation we're going to set our action down here at the bottom, and it needs to match the value of the button edit widget action. So back in that job detail grid form, the button edit miscellaneous property, the action, is what we need to make this match. So they have to exactly match. And then up here, here's our position source field property. You're going to set this position source field property to the name of the column over here in the parent form that needs to have some data input into it, right? It needs that product code information. So the name of the field in the parent table is JD Product, and that's what goes here. That is the source field that's needing the information input into it. So that's the easiest way to think of that position source field property. Which field is it that I'm trying to fill in by using this Zoom form? Well, it's JD Product. Okay, and the very last thing today is talking about creating one of these API device entities, creating a form, if you will, that has the functionality of some of the built-in native APIs on the device. So we'll look at an example here, and you have one in your lab to work on as well. The Maps entity, device entity, I believe. So here's our creating a device form. First thing you do, it's very simple. You just add a relation between the form that's going to use a device API and the mobile entity. Really, you just create the entity like we did in a previous lab, like phone or maps, and then create a button or an action view on the calling form, just like we saw a minute ago for call a Zoom form, right? We used a button edit for that. We used a button to open up the job note list form, so it's the very same type of thing. I'm going to create a button or some other type of action view for the user to be able to trigger so that it knows to call this device API. And then we've got a few properties to set on that relation. So here is an example here. They're using a phone example. So you can see it's not really a form that we're working with. It's really just properties that we're working with. And for phone, notice we just have on the relation, we have the action that's going to trigger the device API call. And that, of course, has to be also configured over here on the calling form, like this accounts form in the example. Needs to have a button or an action configured of some sort, and then the action there needs to match the action here that we have on the relation, call phone. So it has to be called call phone. And then the other part that we have to configure are the parameters, the phone number in this case, since it's the phone device API. So typically what you have here in the parameters are just the column in the database table that has that information. So in this case, for phone, of course, it's the phone number has the information needed for that particular function. So it's very simple. We don't have to know anything about the underlying API that's used on the mobile device. All we have to do is fill in a couple of simple properties. That was pretty quick and straightforward. You do have one of these to configure today in today's lab. So in our example, we're actually using the maps entity. So you get some practice with something different. Okay, so that's our time for today. We've got, we had about 2 hours worth of information there with our break. Let me pop up the lab. We'll go through the lab real quick, and then I'll let you go for the long weekend and to work on your labs. So give me 1 second here. Pull up our lab, and we'll see what you've got in store. So this is Lab 6, Form Behavior Lab. So as you would expect, in your previous lab you started working on your job note grid functionality, and you made it part of the way through. But you hit a stopping point, and we've answered questions from the Module 5 lab in today's material. So now you're ready to be able to finish adding your add functionality to Job Note Grid. And there's some experimentation here. Notice here's one place where I'm having you open up the abstract user interface tree as we did earlier in class. So you can see exactly what resource files, and you can also see all of your different actions that are in place by looking at the abstract user interface tree. Explore that when you bring it up, because there's a lot of information there about the application and all the properties that are set. All right, so we're still experimenting here with the add functionality. Notice we're exploring some of the things we talked about today. The behavior on accept, whether or not you want to exit the form. So this is where you can learn a lot about this data refresh option, what happens when the user selects accept. You're going to find out what happens if they don't have it set to all rows, and you're also going to find out how it looks whenever you have different settings for add behavior or view behavior. So that's actually a fun part of the lab, I think. And then further down, going to implement the Zoom form. So we just talked about how to implement the Zoom form. So you're going to be running the wizard and picking some columns there for the user to pick from. You're going to edit your parent form so that you can add the action and then modify the relation as well to implement that. So that goes through these pages, and then of course test the functionality. And then finally the last exercise is to implement your maps entity. Let me just give you a quick heads up that in the emulator you actually will not be able to see the maps entity work, but you'll be able to tell that it is performing the API call. You'll be able to tell that. There'll be a pause, and then you'll get a message that says something like location services not enabled, this part right here. So that is because you're working with the emulator. Now it is possible to configure an emulator to work with the maps functionality, but there's a lot of steps to it, and they all kind of fall outside of the scope of our class for the next 2 weeks. So here we're just going to say, if you get this message and it looks like it's thinking, then it's actually trying to do something. It's making that device API call, but you just won't see anything. You won't see the map actually pop up. Later, though, when we talk about deployment, if you have a physical device that you can deploy to, you can try that again, and you will see it. So that would be on next Friday. You can actually see that on a real device.